80 AD, Rome, opening day. The Flavian Amphitheater, soon to be known as the Colosseum, stands ready for its inaugural games. It's the largest amphitheater ever built, 4 stories high, nearly 165 feet tall, seating for 50,000 spectators. Emperor Titus sits in the imperial box, looking out over the massive oval arena. Around him, Romans from every social class fill the marble seats. Senators in the front rows, common citizens in the upper levels, even slaves standing in the highest sections. The massive velarium, a retractable awning operated by hundreds of sailors, shields the crowd from the scorching Mediterranean sun. Everyone is here. Everyone is waiting, because what's about to happen has never been seen before. The arena floor begins to change. Water, flooding in from underground channels, rising, filling the space where gladiators normally fight. The crowd murmurs, then gasps, then erupts in cheers. Within hours, the entire arena floor is underwater. A lake, right in the center of Rome's newest monument. And then the ships arrive, not models, not toys, real warships. Scaled-down versions of biremes and triremes, but still massive vessels with oars and rams and fighting platforms. According to the Roman historian Cassius Dio, Emperor Titus suddenly filled the theater with water and brought in horses, bulls, and other animals that had been taught to behave in water, just as on land. Then he brought in people on ships who engaged in a sea fight, impersonating the Corcyraeans and Corinthians, recreating a famous naval battle from ancient Greece. 3,000 men, thousands more rowers, all prisoners of war, all fighting to the end on water. Ships crash into each other with a crunch of splintering wood. Men fall overboard. Some drown immediately, weighed down by armor. Others try to swim, only to be struck by oars or crushed between colliding vessels. Blood spreads across the water in dark clouds. The crowd is on its feet, cheering, chanting, placing bets on which fleet will win. This is a naumachia, a mock naval battle, one of the most expensive, elaborate, and deadly forms of entertainment the Roman world had ever created. And it's just the opening act, because these inaugural games didn't last a day or a week. They lasted 100 days. According to ancient records, approximately 9,000 animals were eliminated during this opening festival. Lions from Africa, bears from Scotland, tigers from Asia, elephants, rhinoceroses, crocodiles, all brought to Rome, all eliminated for entertainment. And the animals weren't the only casualties. Thousands of people passed away in that arena over those 100 days. Gladiators, criminals, prisoners of war, enslaved people forced to fight with no training and no chance of survival. The Romans called it a celebration. They called it entertainment. They called it civilization. Now, if you're watching this and thinking, wait, how did they flood the Colosseum? Excellent question. The answer reveals just how much effort Rome put into creating spectacular violence. The Colosseum was built on the site of Nero's artificial lake, part of his extravagant Golden House palace. The ground was already low-lying, designed to hold water. Roman engineers connected the arena to the Aqua Claudia aqueduct. By opening specific channels, they could flood the arena floor to a depth of about 5 feet, enough to float ships in just a few hours. After the naumachia, they'd drain it just as quickly through a system of underground pipes, and the arena would be ready for gladiatorial combat that same afternoon. It was an engineering marvel, a technical achievement that demonstrated Roman mastery over water, architecture, and logistics. And they used it to stage mass executions disguised as entertainment. But here's what really needs to sink in. These games, the flooded arena, the naval battles, the thousands of casualties, this wasn't unusual. This wasn't Rome at its worst. This wasn't a scandal that shocked the empire. This was considered normal. In fact, according to ancient historian Juvenal, the Roman people were only anxious for 2 things: bread and circuses. Feed them, entertain them, and they won't revolt. Emperors understood this perfectly. The games weren't about cruelty for cruelty's sake. They were about power, about control, about showing the people that their emperor was generous, that their empire was mighty, that Rome could bring the entire world, animals, ships, exotic spectacles, right into their city for free entertainment. The games were political propaganda performed in blood and sand, and the people loved it. 50,000 Romans screaming themselves hoarse as ships sank and men drowned. That wasn't considered disturbing. That was considered a good day out. So here's what I need you to understand before we go any further. The Naumachia, as spectacular and violent as it was, wasn't even the most brutal part of Roman games. It was actually one of the more civilized spectacles. Because, at least in a naval battle, the participants had weapons. They had a chance. They were reenacting military history with some semblance of honor. The other games, the ones that happened daily in Rome and in amphitheaters across the empire, those were designed specifically to maximize suffering and spectacle. And that's what this video is about. 10 brutal games that Romans not only accepted, but celebrated. 10 forms of violence that were woven into the fabric of their civilization. 10 spectacles that help us understand how the empire that gave us roads, aqueducts, law, and architecture also gave us systematic entertainment based on watching people and animals be torn apart. The Colosseum opening was just the beginning. To understand Roman games, we need to understand the daily schedule. Every major game day followed the same pattern. 3 acts: morning, noon, and afternoon. According to the Roman system, these all-day spectacles were typically divided into 3 parts: animal hunts in the morning, executions at midday, and gladiatorial games in the afternoon. Each section had its own purpose, its own audience, its own level of violence. And here's what's interesting: the part we know best, gladiatorial combat, that was actually the most regulated, the most rule-based, the most humane part of the entire day. The morning and midday events, those were pure spectacle, pure violence, pure brutality. That's where we need to start. Because before the gladiators ever entered the arena, before the famous thumb gestures and the dramatic one-on-one combats, the Colosseum hosted forms of violence that would make modern viewers walk out in horror. But Romans, they ate lunch during the worst parts and came back for more. So before we continue, I want you to comment below. How many of these 10 games have you actually heard of? Because I'm willing to bet you know about gladiators. Maybe you know about chariot racing if you've seen Ben-Hur. But the other 8, the daily executions, the fatal mythological reenactments, the systematic use of wild animals as execution methods, the female gladiators, the emperor who fought disabled opponents for sport. Yeah, they don't teach that in school. And that's exactly why we're here. Because understanding what Romans considered entertainment, what they thought was normal, what they celebrated, that tells us something profound about human nature, about power, about how civilizations justify violence. It forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about our own society and what we consider acceptable entertainment. But we'll get to that. First, we need to talk about what happened every morning in the Colosseum. We need to talk about the venaciones, the animal hunts. And trust me, these weren't like anything you've seen at a zoo. Dawn breaks over the Colosseum, 80 AD. The gates open at sunrise. Free entry for all Roman citizens. The first spectators file in thousands of people looking for a full day of entertainment. They're not here for gladiators yet. That's the afternoon show. They're here for the morning games, the venaciones, the animal hunts. And what they're about to see will set the tone for one of the longest days of violence in human history. Game 1, venaciones, the morning animal hunts. The arena floor is clean, fresh sand raked into perfect patterns. The morning sun illuminates the space. Then the trapdoors open. Lions burst into the arena. Tigers, bears, leopards. Animals that have been starved, beaten, deliberately enraged to make them aggressive. According to historical records, Romans brought in exotic animals from across their empire. Lions from Africa, tigers from Asia, bears from Scotland beyond Hadrian's Wall, even rhinoceroses and elephants. But these aren't just animal displays. These aren't zoos. These are fights. Animals forced to battle each other or fight against professional beast fighters called bestiarii. One famous bestiarius named Carpophorus became legendary for taking down 20 beasts in a single battle. Lions, bears, leopards, all in one afternoon's work. The crowd places bets. Which animal will win? How many animals can one fighter take down? Will the rhino actually charge or just stand there like poets complained it sometimes did? There's even one recorded story about a bear from Caledonia, the far north of the empire, modern Scotland being matched against a lion from North Africa. The Romans loved the symbolism. The fiercest beast from the north versus the fiercest from the south. Let the best continent win. Here's what Romans didn't think about: the ecological impact. Some historians believe that Rome's massive demand for wild animals to be eliminated in their arenas had a serious effect on wildlife populations across North Africa. Bears that once roamed the Atlas Mountains, gone. Lions that prowl the Mediterranean coast, hunted to near extinction for entertainment. During the Colosseum's inaugural games, those 100 days under Titus, approximately 9,000 animals were eliminated. 9,000. That's not a typo. That's the documented number from ancient historians. In just over 3 months, Rome wiped out the equivalent of multiple modern zoos' worth of animals. And this wasn't a one-time event. This happened regularly, multiple times a year, in amphitheaters across the empire for 400 years. Game 2, Damnatio ad Bestias, execution by beasts. Around noon, as the sun reaches its peak and the heat becomes unbearable, something changes. The wealthy, Romans, the senators, the equestrians, the noble families, they get up and leave. Time for lunch, time to escape the heat. But the lower classes, the common people, the poor, the enslaved, they stay. Because what happens at noon is considered the midday spectacle, and it's designed specifically for them. This is when the criminals are brought in. Damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to beasts. It's a form of public execution where convicted criminals are thrown to wild animals in the arena. The condemned are brought out, often completely naked, and tied to stakes in the center of the arena. They're given no weapons, no armor, no chance. Then the animals are released. According to ancient sources, the animals used for these executions were deliberately starved to make them more aggressive. They'd been trained, or more accurately, tortured to attack humans on sight. Cicero recorded one instance where a single lion eliminated 200 criminals in succession. 200. One after another. The crowd cheered with each attack. They placed bets on which criminal would last longest, which would be chosen by which animal, who would try to run and who would stand still in terror. But here's where it gets even more disturbing. The Romans didn't just throw people to animals. They engineered creative ways to maximize the spectacle. One method involved seesaws. Criminals would be tied to opposite ends of large seesaws, positioned throughout the arena. Starved animals would be released into the space. As one criminal desperately jumped up to escape the snapping jaws below him, his partner on the other side of the seesaw would crash down directly into the waiting claws and teeth of another beast. The crowd laughed. They found it hilarious. The dark comedy of watching men desperately try to save themselves while accidentally dooming each other. This wasn't just execution. This was entertainment, architecture. This was engineered suffering. Who got condemned to damnatio ad bestias? Military deserters, political criminals, people who committed murder or arson, enslaved people who tried to escape or harmed their enslavers. And between the 1st and 3rd centuries AD, Christians. Though modern scholars debate the extent to which Christians were specifically targeted, and there's no solid evidence for Christians being executed specifically in the Colosseum, ancient sources do record Christians being condemned to beasts in various Roman arenas. The punishment served multiple purposes. It was justice, yes, but it was also deterrence, social control, a constant reminder of what happened when you broke Roman law or challenged Roman power. And it was considered a reminder of the protection the empire provided from the dangers of the natural world. Those who obeyed Rome were safe. Those who didn't, back to the wild, back to being prey. Game 3, fatal charades, mythological executions. But wait, it gets weirder and somehow more disturbing. The Romans didn't just execute criminals. They turned executions into theater. Historians call these fatal charades. The Romans called them visualizing or reenacting Greek and Roman myths, but with real condemned criminals in the starring roles. And the myths always ended with someone being torn apart. Here's how it worked. A criminal would be forced to play a character from mythology who died horribly. Then that death would be reenacted in the arena for real, with real animals, with a real person actually experiencing what the mythological character supposedly experienced. One of the most popular performances involved a criminal playing Laureolus, a famous bandit from Roman legend. The criminal would be dressed as Laureolus. He'd act out the crimes, theft, murder, religious taboos. Then, in the arena, he'd be captured by Roman soldiers, crucified on a real cross, and then a bear would be released to tear him apart while he was still alive on the cross. The crowd got to see justice, mythology, and violence all at once. 3 types of entertainment combined into one horrific spectacle. Another example, a criminal might be forced to play Icarus, the boy who flew too close to the sun. They'd strap makeshift wings to his arms, hoist him up high in the arena on some kind of crane or platform, then drop him. If he survived the fall, bears would be waiting below to finish him. One more. A woman might be forced to play Pasiphae from Greek mythology, a character known for a disturbing mythological story involving a bull. I won't go into graphic detail, but the execution would involve reenacting that myth in a way that condemned both the criminal and the mythological character she was forced to portray. The purpose behind these fatal charades was multi-layered. It made executions entertaining through storytelling. The crowd got narrative, drama, mythological education, and violence all at once. It allowed Romans to condemn not just the criminal, but also the mythological figures who committed similar crimes or taboos. By showing these myths ending in horrible deaths, Rome was sending a message about which behaviors were unacceptable. It demonstrated Roman sophistication and culture. Look, we know Greek mythology. We're educated. We can put on elaborate performances, and it normalized the violence by framing it as educational and cultural. Let me be clear about something. All of this, the animal hunts, the executions, the theatrical violence, this all happened before the main event. This was the warm-up. The Venaciones started at dawn. The executions ran through midday, and all of it was designed to build anticipation for what Romans really came to see. The afternoon gladiatorial games. That's when the arena would be cleaned, fresh sand spread, and the professional fighters would emerge from the underground passages to battle in what's become the most iconic image of ancient Rome. But we'll get to that. Because even gladiatorial combat, as brutal as it was, followed rules. There were referees, weight classes, different fighting styles, training, strategy. There was at least some structure to the violence. The morning and midday spectacles, pure chaos, pure spectacle, pure brutality, with no pretense of sport or honor, just suffering, engineered for maximum entertainment value. So let me ask you, of these first 3 games, the animal hunts, the executions by beasts, the fatal mythological reenactments, which one shocks you most? Comment below, because I'm genuinely curious. Most people know about gladiators, but did you know about the seesaws, the theatrical executions, the systematic elimination of thousands of animals for entertainment? Probably not, because that's not what gets taught in schools. And we're only 3 games in. We've got 7 more to go, including gladiatorial combat, yes, but also female gladiators, emperors who fought disabled opponents for sport, and naval battles that left thousands of men drowned in a flooded arena. But first, we need to talk about the main event. We need to talk about Game 4, the afternoon spectacle that defined Rome, the horn blasts. 3 sharp notes echoing through the Colosseum. The crowd, all 50,000 of them, rises to its feet. The wealthy Romans who left for lunch are back, refreshed, ready for what they actually came to see. The poor who stayed through the morning slaughter lean forward with renewed energy, because the afternoon games are about to begin. The underground gates creak open, and through the darkness of the passages, the gladiators emerge into the blinding afternoon sun. Game 4, gladiatorial combat, the rules of death. Here's what most people don't understand about Roman gladiators. They weren't random prisoners thrown into an arena to fight to the end. They were professional fighters, athletes, specialists with years of training behind them. According to historical records, Gladiators trained in schools called ludi. The most famous was the Ludus Magnus, located right next to the Colosseum, connected by an underground tunnel so fighters could walk directly from their training grounds into the arena without ever seeing daylight. These weren't just combat schools. They were businesses, investment properties. A gladiator represented thousands of hours of training and massive amounts of resources. Laniste, the trainers who owned gladiators, treated them as expensive assets. They rented them out to games across the empire for profit. And like any valuable asset, they didn't want to lose them unnecessarily. Here's the economic reality that Hollywood gets wrong. Most gladiatorial fights did not end with someone being eliminated. In the early years of the Colosseum, yes, more fights were to the end, but as time went on, the contests became less lethal because replacing eliminated gladiators was expensive. According to sources, contracts between Laniste and the game's sponsors stipulated heavy compensation for gladiators who were ended in combat, often 50 times the rental price for the fighter. 50 times, that's like renting a car for $100 and having to pay $5,000 if it gets destroyed. The financial incentive to keep gladiators alive was enormous. So how did it actually work? First, understand there were different types of gladiators, each with specialized equipment, fighting styles, and strategies. The Thracian carried a curved sword and small shield, emphasizing speed and agility. The Murmillo wore heavy armor, with a large rectangular shield and straight sword, a tank, basically. The Retiarius fought with a net and trident, minimal armor, relying on range and entanglement. The Secutor was specifically designed to fight the Retiarius, with a smooth helmet so the net wouldn't catch on it. These weren't random matchups. They were carefully orchestrated fights between complementary styles. Speed versus power, range versus armor. The variety created strategic interest, not just bloodshed. Fights were monitored by referees summa rudis, who ensured rules were followed. There were actual rules. Techniques were judged. Cowardice was penalized. Fighting with honor mattered. And when a gladiator was defeated, disarmed, wounded, unable to continue, he could signal surrender by raising a finger. Then the crowd decided thumbs, the famous gesture. Though historians still debate which direction meant what. If the gladiator had fought well, shown courage, given the crowd a good show, he'd likely be spared. Missus, released to fight another day. If he'd fought poorly, shown cowardice, disappointed the crowd, the sponsor of the games, often the emperor, might give the signal for execution. Jugula, end him. But here's where it gets dark again. When a gladiator was condemned to die, the process was methodical. According to sources describing the Colosseum's procedures, attendants dressed as Mercury, the god who guided souls to the underworld, would poke the fallen gladiator with a red-hot iron to verify he was actually ended, not faking. If there was any sign of life, another attendant dressed as Charon, the ferryman of the dead, would finish him with a giant mace to the head. Then the body would be stripped of armor and weapons, dragged through the Porta Libetinaria, the gate named after Libetina, goddess of funerals, and the equipment would be handed to the newest recruits. The circle continued. One fighter's end was another fighter's beginning. Game 5, Female Gladiators, the Forgotten Warriors. Now, here's something they definitely don't teach in school. Women fought in the arena too. Female gladiators, gladiatrices, existed throughout the Roman Empire, though they were rarer than their male counterparts. Some were enslaved women forced into combat. Others were volunteers, free women, who chose to become gladiators, seeking fame, fortune, or escape from their circumstances. Female gladiators fought each other, sometimes fought against male opponents in mismatched novelty bouts, and occasionally were pitted against dwarfs or exotic animals as spectacle. The Romans had complicated feelings about this. On one hand, watching women fight violated traditional Roman gender norms. Respectable women were supposed to be modest, domestic, confined to the home. On the other hand, and this is where it gets really bizarre, the spectacle was too entertaining to resist. Eventually, it became such a popular spectacle that noble Roman women started wanting to participate. Wealthy, aristocratic women actually volunteered to fight in the arena, seeking the thrill and attention. This scandalized Roman leadership so thoroughly that emperors started passing laws against it. Not because they objected to the violence against women, they objected to upper-class women debasing themselves by fighting like enslaved people and criminals. The class transgression was more offensive than the violence. Female gladiators were eventually banned entirely, not out of mercy or recognition that forcing women to fight to entertain crowds was wrong, but because the wrong kind of women wanted to participate. Game 6. Emperor Commodus, the gladiator who ruled Rome. Which brings us to one of the most unhinged examples of Roman imperial excess. Emperor Commodus, portrayed by Joaquin Phoenix in the movie Gladiator. The real Commodus was actually worse than the film version. According to the Roman historian Cassius Dio, Commodus was obsessed with gladiatorial combat and ventured into the arena himself many times, hundreds of times by some accounts. But here's the thing, he didn't fight fair. Commodus used his position as emperor to set up rigged fights against handicapped opponents, disabled people, animals with claws removed, or gladiators who were ordered not to fight back. He would maim and end them in often sadistic spectacles, then demand payment from the Roman treasury for his services as a gladiator. That's right, he made Rome pay him to watch him torment defenseless victims. He fought wild animals, but from behind specially engineered protective galleries, where he'd shoot arrows at trapped beasts who couldn't reach him. According to Cassius Dio, he reportedly ended over 100 bears this way. He fought gladiators, but they were given wooden weapons while he had real ones. He fought disabled people, individuals with physical handicaps, tied together and forced to combat him while he ended them for sport. The Roman elite were horrified. Not because of the cruelty, remember. They just spent the morning watching criminals torn apart by animals, but because an emperor was debasing himself by fighting like a common gladiator. The class transgression again. The violence was fine. The emperor participating was scandalous. According to ancient sources, Commodus's cruelty and his insistence on these spectacles contributed significantly to his eventual elimination by assassination. They strangled him in his bath in 192 AD. But Commodus wasn't the only emperor who used the games sadistically. Emperor Domitian reportedly had a spectator dragged into the arena and thrown to ravenous dogs for jeering at one of his favorite gladiators. The man's crime? Heckling. Booing. The ancient Roman equivalent of shouting during a sports game. His punishment? Torn apart by dogs in front of 50,000 people. That's how seriously emperors took these games. They weren't just entertainment. They were expressions of imperial power. Challenges to the spectacle were challenges to the emperor himself. Now, here's what I need you to understand. Gladiatorial combat, as brutal as it was, actually followed rules. There were weight classes, fighting styles, referees, appeals to the crowd. There was structure, strategy, skill. Gladiators could become famous, they could win their freedom, they could survive and retire. Some even got married, had families, lived to old age. It was violent. It was often lethal, but it was regulated violence. The morning and midday games, pure chaos, pure spectacle. Defenseless victims torn apart for entertainment. But the afternoon gladiatorial fights, those were Rome's version of professional sports. Brutal professional sports, yes, but with athletes, training, rules, and a chance however slim of survival and even glory. That's what made them more palatable to the Roman elite. That's what allowed philosophers to attend gladiatorial games while condemning the midday executions. The veneer of sport, the pretense of honor, the structure that made systematic violence seem like legitimate competition. But we're not done yet. Because gladiatorial combat, female fighters, and sadistic emperors, those were still following Roman traditions, however twisted. The next 3 games we're covering, they push boundaries, even Romans found shocking. We're talking about flooding the entire arena to stage naval battles where thousands drowned. We're talking about chariot racing that was more popular than gladiators and resulted in citywide riots. We're talking about engineering increasingly exotic spectacles as emperors competed to outdo each other. And we're talking about a halftime show of mass executions that kept the crowds entertained while the gladiators rested. So before we continue, Which of these 3 afternoon games shocked you most? The economic calculations behind keeping gladiators alive? The fact that women fought too? Or Emperor Commodus fighting disabled opponents and charging Rome for the privilege of watching him commit atrocities? Comment below. Because we're about to escalate. The games we've covered so far happened regularly, multiple times a year. Standard entertainment. The next 3 were reserved for special occasions. Imperial celebrations, triumphs, the grandest spectacles Rome could engineer. And they required resources, engineering, and casualties on a scale that makes everything we've discussed so far look almost modest. Starting with the game that required flooding the Colosseum with millions of gallons of water. We have covered 6 games so far. 6 different forms of violence that Romans considered normal entertainment. But here's what you need to understand. Everything we've discussed, the animal hunts, the executions, the gladiatorial combat, all of that was standard. Regular, the kind of entertainment you'd see multiple times a year in amphitheaters across the empire. The next 3 games, these were reserved for special occasions. Imperial celebrations, military triumphs, the inauguration of massive monuments, times when emperors needed to demonstrate not just Rome's power, but its engineering genius and unlimited resources. And nothing demonstrated that better than flooding an entire amphitheater to stage a naval battle. Game 7, Naumachia, the scale of death on water. We opened this video with the Colosseum's inaugural Naumachia in 80 AD. But I need you to understand the full scope of what these naval battles actually entailed. Because the Colosseum Naumachia, as spectacular as it was, wasn't even the largest one. The very first Naumachia on record was staged by Julius Caesar in 46 BC, and it set the standard for imperial excess. Caesar ordered a massive basin dug near the Tiber River. According to ancient sources, this artificial lake measured approximately 1,800 feet long by 1,200 feet wide. It was surrounded by marble seating for spectators. Then he filled it with ships, real warships, scaled-down versions of biremes, triremes, and quadremes, ancient war galleys with multiple rows of oars. The battle featured 2,000 fighters and 4,000 rowers, all of them prisoners of war. The ships represented Egyptian and Tyrian fleets, reenacting historical battles from Rome's conquests. And when it was over, the basin was immediately filled in, drained and buried to prevent disease from standing water. That was the disposable nature of these spectacles. Dig a lake, fight a battle, bury it, move on. But Caesar's Naumachia was topped by his successor. In 2 BC, Emperor Augustus created an even larger artificial lake, this one measuring 1,800 by 1,200 Roman feet, approximately 533 by 355 meters. He even built a dedicated aqueduct to fill it. According to Augustus's own written account, the Res Gestae, this Naumachia featured 3,000 men, not counting rowers, fighting in 30 vessels, 30 full-size warships, thousands of men, all for a single day's entertainment. The battle recreated the Greeks defeating the Persians at the Battle of Salamis. Historical education through mass violence. And here's what's crucial. These weren't theatrical performances. The ancient sources are clear. These were real fights. Real ships crashed into each other with bronze rams designed to puncture hulls. Real men drowned, were crushed between colliding vessels, or were cut down in hand-to-hand combat on the decks. The casualty rates were staggering. The most horrific Naumachia might have been the one staged by Emperor Claudius in 52 AD. Claudius held his naval battle on the Fucine Lake in central Italy to celebrate the completion of a massive drainage project. According to the historian Suetonius, this Naumachia involved 100 ships and 19,000 condemned prisoners. 19,000 people, rafts filled with Praetorian guards, surrounded the entire lake to prevent escapes. An immense crowd gathered on the surrounding mountains to watch. According to the sources, the prisoners actually approached Claudius before the battle began, saluting him with the now famous phrase, Ave Imperator, morituri te salutant, Hail Emperor, those who are about to die salute you. Claudius apparently responded, or not, suggesting some might survive. But the sources also indicate that in this particular Naumachia, mercy was promised to the survivors a rare exception that proves the normal expectation was total elimination. Now, back to the Colosseum's Naumachia. Modern historians have calculated exactly how the flooding would have worked. The arena's elliptical floor measured approximately 80 by 45 meters. To flood it to a depth of 1.5 meters, enough to float scaled-down ships would require about 17,000 cubic meters of water. The Colosseum was connected to the Aqua Claudia aqueduct. By directing all that water flow into the arena, engineers could flood it in approximately 2 to 5 hours. After the battle, 4 drainage culverts positioned at the main axes would empty the arena in roughly the same amount of time. That's the engineering marvel. Morning, dry arena with animal hunts. Midday, flooded arena with naval combat. Afternoon, drained arena with gladiatorial fights. 3 completely different spectacles. Same space, same day. But here's the thing about Colosseum Naumachia. They only happen during the first few years. According to historical evidence, Emperor Domitian, who ruled from 81 to 96 AD, expanded the underground passages and mechanical systems beneath the arena floor. He built the Hypogeum, that complex network of tunnels, cages, and lifting platforms we associate with the Colosseum today. Once that underground system was in place, flooding became impossible. You can't fill a space with water when it's got multiple levels of passages and mechanisms below it. So Naumachia in the Colosseum stopped. After that, if emperors wanted naval battles, they had to build special basins or use existing lakes. Domitian himself staged a Naumachia in 89 AD in a new basin he had constructed beyond the Tiber. According to Cassius Dio, this one took place during a violent rainstorm. The spectacle continued despite the weather, and not only did all the combatants perish, but many spectators also lost their lives when the emperor refused to let anyone leave during the storm. That's how seriously emperors took these games. Better for citizens to drown in the stands than to allow them to leave before the spectacle concluded. Game 8, chariot racing, Rome's most popular sport. Now here's something that might surprise you. When we think of Roman entertainment, we think of gladiators. The Colosseum, one-on-one combat in the arena. But that's not what most Romans spent their time watching. The most popular spectator sport in ancient Rome by far was chariot racing. The Circus Maximus, Rome's chariot racing stadium, could hold approximately 300,000 spectators. That's 6 times the capacity of the Colosseum. 300,000 people crammed into a massive oval stadium to watch horses and chariots race around a track at deadly speeds. The races were violent, dangerous, and absolutely addictive for Roman audiences. Here's how they worked. 7 laps around the track, approximately 3 to 5 miles total. 2-horse or 4-horse chariots driven by professional charioteers who were treated like modern sports celebrities. The chariots were divided into factions teams identified by colors. The blues, the greens, the reds, the whites. Romans were fanatical about their factions. They bet enormous sums. They rioted when their team lost. Citywide violence between blue and green supporters was common. The racing itself was extreme. The turning posts at each end of the track were the most dangerous points. Chariots would pile up during turns. Crashes were common. Charioteers could be thrown from their chariots and trampled by the horses behind them. The drivers tied the reins around their waists to maintain control, which meant if they were thrown from the chariot, they'd be dragged behind galloping horses, unless they could cut the reins with a knife they carried for exactly that purpose. Many didn't cut fast enough. The mortality rate for professional charioteers was incredibly high. But the successful ones, the ones who survived long enough to become famous, earned fortunes and had enormous fan followings. Some charioteers' names are still known today because their fans erected monuments to them. They were the ancient equivalent of Formula One drivers, celebrated athletes risking their lives for entertainment and glory. Game 9, exotic animal spectacles, the search for novelty. As emperors competed to outdo each other's games, they started getting creative with animal spectacles. Simple lion versus tiger fights became boring. Romans wanted novelty, surprise, animals they'd never seen before. So emperors sent procurement teams across the known world to bring back exotic creatures. According to the poet Martial, who witnessed the Colosseum's inaugural games, animals came from as far as Persia to the east and Scotland to the north. And Romans didn't just want to see these animals, they wanted to see them fight. One account describes a battle between a Caledonian bear from Scotland and a lion from North Africa. The symbolism was obvious. Let the fiercest beast from the northern edge of the empire fight the fiercest from the south. Another famous story involves a rhinoceros brought to Rome. According to sources, poets initially wrote with frustration because the rhino just sat there in the arena, refusing to fight or move. Then finally, it got into a wild rage and started tossing bulls up into the air with its horn. The crowd went wild. This is what they wanted: the unexpected, the exotic, the spectacular. In 57 AD, Emperor Nero took it even further. His Naumachia didn't just feature ships and men, he added water creatures, seals, hippos, swimming in the flooded arena alongside the naval combat. What happened to these aquatic animals when the arena was drained immediately after? The sources don't say. But the logistics of removing live hippos from a partially drained amphitheater must have been, at minimum, complicated. Romans also trained animals to do tricks and perform acrobatics before they were eliminated in combat. Elephants were taught to walk tightropes. Bears were trained to wrestle. Various animals performed coordinated routines. Then, as the finale, they'd be pitted against each other or against human fighters in fatal combat. The entertainment value was in the contrast. Watch the elephant balance gracefully on a rope, then watch it fight to the finish. The Romans' capacity for both appreciating animal intelligence and then immediately destroying it for spectacle is genuinely disturbing. Here's what ties all three of these games together. They required resources on an imperial scale. Flooding an arena meant controlling massive water systems. Chariot racing meant breeding and training thousands of horses. Exotic animal spectacles meant global supply chains stretching across 3 continents. These weren't just violent. They were expensive, logistically complex engineering feats. And they demonstrated Rome's power more effectively than any military parade. When you could flood an amphitheater, race 300 chariots, and display animals from Scotland to Persia, all in the same week, you were showing the world that Rome controlled everything. Resources, water, animals, human lives, engineering, nature itself. Nothing was beyond Roman power to command, control, and destroy for entertainment. And speaking of destruction for entertainment, we've got one more game to cover. Game 10, the halftime show. The spectacle that happened between the morning animal hunts and the afternoon gladiatorial fights. The one that Romans themselves were most ambivalent about. The mass executions, multiple methods, maximum suffering, designed specifically to keep the crowds in their seats during the hottest part of the day. Because apparently, regular executions by beasts weren't enough. Romans engineered entire systems to make public death as entertaining as possible. We've covered 9 games. 9 different forms of violence that Romans engineered, perfected, and celebrated. But there's one more, and it might be the most disturbing of all. Not because it was the most violent. We've already seen Naumachia, where thousands drowned, animal hunts where creatures were tortured, executions where people were torn apart. Game 10 is disturbing because of what it reveals about how Romans thought about death, entertainment, and the value of human life. It's called the halftime show, and it was specifically designed to keep you in your seat. Game 10, the halftime show. Mass executions as filler. Here's the problem Romans faced. The games were all-day affairs. Morning animal hunts, afternoon gladiatorial combat. But there was a gap. Midday, the hottest part of the day, the time when wealthy Romans left for lunch and the arena needed to be cleaned and reset. The crowd might leave. The momentum might be lost. People might not come back. So Romans filled that time with executions. Lots of them. Multiple methods. Maximum spectacle. All designed as, and I'm not exaggerating, filler content. According to ancient sources, this became known as the blood-spattered halftime show. The damnatio ad bestias executions we discussed earlier were part of this, but it expanded far beyond just throwing people to animals. This was when Romans got creative with mass death. Multiple execution methods happening simultaneously across the arena. Stakes, crosses, burning, animals, fatal charades, all at once. Different condemned criminals being eliminated in different ways to provide variety. It was industrial scale execution disguised as entertainment scheduling. And here's what makes it particularly dark. As the Roman Empire grew and leaders became more arrogant and unhinged, these midday spectacles became increasingly elaborate and cruel. According to ancient historians, when butcher meat became prohibitively expensive during Emperor Caligula's reign, he ordered that prisoners be fed to the animals instead. Not as punishment, as cost savings. He was literally using human prisoners as animal feed to reduce the imperial budget. That's the level of dehumanization we're talking about. Some of the condemned knew what awaited them and chose to take their own lives rather than face the arena. Historical sources record specific instances. A German prisoner choked himself by eating a sponge. Groups of men strangled each other in their cells the night before their scheduled executions. 20 Saxon prisoners, according to ancient accounts, chose to strangle one another rather than enter the Colosseum as gladiators. They chose death on their own terms over becoming entertainment. Think about that. These were people so certain of the horror awaiting them that collective elimination seemed preferable. And Romans knew this happened. Guards watched prisoners constantly to prevent these escapes through self-inflicted death. Because if prisoners ended themselves, they couldn't be eliminated publicly. And public execution was the point. The suffering had to be visible, had to be witnessed, had to entertain. So let me ask the obvious question. Why? Why did Rome, this sophisticated civilization that built aqueducts and roads, created law and government, produced literature and philosophy, why did they engineer systematic violence on this scale? The answer is complicated, but it breaks down into a few key functions. Political control. We've mentioned bread and circuses multiple times, but let's be explicit about what that means. Roman emperors used games to win public favor, distract from political unrest, and reinforce their authority. According to historians, games were held to celebrate military victories, honor gods, or mark significant events like an emperor's accession to power. By sponsoring lavish spectacles, emperors displayed their generosity while subtly reminding the populace of their absolute power. The arena became a political stage where imperial propaganda was enacted in blood and sand. Even the decision of life or demise for a defeated gladiator had political weight. The emperor's thumb could spare or condemn a constant visual reminder of his power over life and death. Social control. The games served as a constant reminder of what happened when you broke Roman law or challenged Roman power. Public executions functioned as deterrent and justice system combined. According to some scholars, spectacles like damnatio ad bestias helped uphold social norms. By executing criminals in the roles of mythological figures who transgressed, Rome was condemning both the criminal and the behavior simultaneously, demonstrating imperial might. When you could bring animals from Scotland, Persia, and Africa to fight in your arena, when you could flood an amphitheater or race 300 chariots, you were showing the world that Rome controlled everything. Resources, water, animals, human lives, engineering, nature itself. The spectacles were proof of imperial reach and unlimited power. Practical function. Some historians argue these spectacles served as a release valve for the urban poor. Give them entertainment, and they won't riot. Give them spectacular violence, and they'll be too satisfied to revolt. Whether this actually worked is debatable, but emperors certainly believed it did. So how did it end? The spread of Christianity and its different views on human life contributed significantly to the decline of these spectacles. According to historical sources, during the reign of Emperor Honorius, a Christian monk named Telemachus leapt from the stands and tried to physically separate two gladiators who were fighting. The spectators, enraged that he'd interrupted their entertainment, stoned him to death. But according to tradition, this incident led directly to the end of gladiatorial fights. Whether that's historically accurate or legend, it represents a turning point. Christian emperors generally opposed such spectacles. Honorius suspended gladiatorial games, Emperor Valentinian abolished them in 438 AD. Animal hunts continued longer. The last recorded hunts at the Colosseum occurred around 523 AD. But it wasn't just Christianity that ended the games. It was also economics. The financial burden of these spectacles became unsustainable. Procuring exotic animals, maintaining professional gladiators, building and maintaining amphitheaters, it drained the imperial treasury. As Rome declined economically and politically, the resources needed for massive games simply weren't available anymore. The Colosseum itself was eventually reduced to a quarry. For roughly 1,000 years before preservation efforts began in the 18th and 19th centuries, Romans stripped its marble and stone for other building projects. The monument to systematic entertainment violence became a source of building materials. A fitting end, perhaps. Now let me bring this full circle. We've covered 10 brutal games, 10 forms of violence that Romans not only accepted, but celebrated for 400 years. Animal hunts that devastated wildlife populations across 3 continents. Executions by beasts that turned death into theater. Fatal charades that merged mythology and murder. Gladiatorial combat that created professional violence as spectator sport. Female gladiators who complicated our understanding of Roman gender roles. An emperor who rigged fights against disabled opponents. Naval battles where thousands drowned for entertainment. Chariot racing that drew crowds 6 times larger than the Colosseum. Exotic animal spectacles that demonstrated global imperial reach. And mass executions designed as scheduling filler. All of it was considered normal entertainment. So here's the question we need to grapple with. What does this tell us about human nature? About civilization? About the capacity of sophisticated societies to normalize extreme violence? Because Rome wasn't barbaric by their standards. They thought of themselves as civilized, sophisticated, the pinnacle of human achievement. They created law, philosophy, engineering marvels, democratic principles, art, literature, and they also created systematic entertainment based on watching people and animals be torn apart. Both things were true simultaneously. And here's the really uncomfortable part. We're still fascinated by it. We make movies about gladiators. We create video games where you fight in arenas. We watch documentaries about Roman spectacles. You're watching this video right now. The violence still draws us. We're still curious about it. We still want to see it, even if we condemn it. So how different are we, really? We don't have gladiatorial combat anymore. We don't throw people to lions. We've eliminated the most extreme forms of violence as entertainment. But we have combat sports, where people deliberately hurt each other. We have violent films and video games. We have sports where serious injury is expected and accepted. I'm not saying these are equivalent to Roman games. They're obviously not. Modern combat sports have medical oversight, consent, safety regulations, and much lower mortality rates. But the fundamental human fascination with watching violence, that hasn't gone away. Here's what I think we can learn from this history. First, context matters. Understanding the full truth about Roman games, not the sanitized Hollywood version, but the actual systematic violence, helps us understand how societies can normalize practices that later generations will condemn. Second, civilization doesn't prevent cruelty. Rome was civilized and cruel. Those things coexisted. The presence of philosophy and engineering doesn't guarantee moral progress. Third, questioning our own society is essential. Romans couldn't see their own moral blind spots. What are ours? What practices that we consider normal today will people 2,000 years from now look back on with horror? And fourth, change is possible, but slow. It took Christianity centuries to end gladiatorial combat. It took economic collapse to fully stop the spectacles. But they did stop. Practices that seemed permanent and natural eventually ended. So let me ask you directly, which of these 10 games shocked you most? Did you know about any of this before watching? And do you think we should teach the full truth about Roman entertainment in schools? Comment below, because I'm genuinely curious about your reactions. If this video changed how you think about ancient Rome or about violence in our own society, hit that like button. If you want more history that they don't teach in schools, subscribe. We're covering the dark side of the Roman Empire next week, what happened to enslaved people in Roman households. the systematic violence that built the empire, the practices that make the games look almost tame by comparison. And share this video, because I guarantee most people don't know this history. They know about gladiators, they know about the Colosseum, but they don't know about the seesaws, the fatal charades, the mass executions, the 19,000 prisoners fighting on a lake, the emperor who charged Rome to watch him torment disabled victims. They should know, because understanding what humans are capable of, what sophisticated, civilized societies are capable of normalizing, that matters. The past wasn't glorious. It was complicated, brutal, and human. And knowing the full truth, not the comfortable mythology, but the real, documented, disturbing truth, that's how we learn. Say their names. The thousands who drowned in Naumachia. The 9,000 animals eliminated during the Colosseum's opening. The countless criminals, prisoners, and enslaved people who died for entertainment. The disabled victims Commodus tormented. The female gladiators history forgot. They existed, they suffered, and their stories are part of Roman legacy just as much as the philosophy and the engineering. Don't forget them.